Hello, this is your host Todd Lewis of the Praise of Folly podcast. This is the 7th episode of the Lyceum Roundtable. Today, we are going to discuss democracy versus the sort of Hoppian construction or reactionary construction that all non-monarchical forms of government are democracies. But I'll sort of throw this framing over to Swithun. He's sort of thought about this a little bit. So why don't you frame this discussion for us today, Swithun?
Thanks, Todd. If any of you listen to mine and Todd's discussion of Hoppe's view of monarchy, the issue was raised whether or not republics were meaningfully different from democracies. Hoppe's view is that any sort of voting of any description for any office or any office holder within a governmental system is de facto a form of democracy, and therefore an example of a public rather than a private government, where the office holders are there to represent, to some extent, the people and are sort of trustees of the public assets in the state, in contrast to the unconstitutional monarch who treats the assets of the state his own personal private property. So the Hoppian view then is that there's no real distinction between anything within what you would call public government, the difference between, say, mass democracy and what you might consider more traditional republican forms of government. He would recognize them on a sliding scale, but he wouldn't recognize a qualitative difference between them, given his distinction between public and private government. So what we're interested in here today is whether or not there is any real qualitative difference between republics versus democracies. And if that is the case, or even if it's not, how might one move away from our current sort of mass democratic system to a more sort of republican form of government? So this is what we came up. This is what we discussed to some extent with Todd. So Todd, what's your views on this?
Okay, so as usual, I start with Aristotle on this question. He seems to have created the best framework under which analyzing political institutions can occur. He makes the distinction horizontally and vertically. So vertically, we have the rule of the one, the few, and the many. And then horizontally, at each stage, we have well, let me back it up. The politics should be read as an addendum to the Nicomachean Ethics. The Nicomachean Ethics ends with the question, what is the means by which we create and cultivate virtue in the citizen body, to create a society of virtue? And then he says, well, that's up for the polis to create just laws and educate the people. So he then moves into the politics, which is sort of a sequel to the Nicomachean Ethics. And now he says, well, we have the rule of the one, the few, and the many. That's the horizontal, the vertical rather, analysis. And then each one, looking back to his Nicomachean Ethics, we see that there's what's called virtue and vice. And virtue is sort of the golden mean. It's the optimal behavior to choose at a given time. A vice could either be a defect or an excess. So let's use the virtue of courage. Courage is doing something that's brave at the right time, for the right reasons, for the right reasons. And so cowardice is a deficiency and rashness is an excess. So then we see that the virtuous rule of the one, a monarch, is one who rules according to the good of the common good. And then the private good, the good of the individual, that would be the tyrant. That'd be the vicious form. And then we have the rule of the few. We have aristocracy, the rule of the best. They rule for the good of all. And then the oligarchy, which rules for profit. And then we also see the rule of the many, which in the virtuous form is politeia, and which seems to be identified with Solon the lawgiver, and its vicious form, democracy. Now, Aristotle makes a proviso when he's describing Agamemnon, the sort of classic Greek king hero, that a sort of, if a man were to become so virtuous, he becomes godlike. It would be incumbent upon all people to follow him. But Aristotle says that that's unlikely because one man is easily corrupted. It's harder to corrupt a group of men than one man. And he also argues that you can't give this one man too much power, and it's really almost impossible to be that virtuous. So even though there might be some theoretical ideal form of government would be the monarchy, it's a theoretical ideal he admits you really can't reach. The ideal actual form of government is a mixed constitution, which is partly democratic and partly oligarchic. And in fact, that's the only constitution under which you can cultivate virtue, according to Aristotle. So we then see, well, what's a republic now? A republic classically is defined by Cicero as a mixed government. I guess you could even argue it's defined by Aristotle as a mixed government. But in its sort of full-bodied definition, it has elements of the monarch, elements of the aristocracy, and elements of the people. The Roman Republic for Machiavelli was the flagship example of this. The consuls were the monarchical element. There were two of them, like in Sparta. There were two kings, but the Roman consuls were elected. And then you had the Senate, which is the aristocratic element. And then you had the tribune of the plebs, who represented the popular element. So now we have all three elements being represented in the Republican system. And Cicero himself tends to take a more oligarchic approach, that he says that of the three competing interests within the Republic, it's best to have the governing interest be that which is the moneyed interest. So in that regard, Cicero would be on board with Madison and the founding fathers. Whereas Aristotle said the class interest that should be the governing interest should be the middle class, because the middle class does not have so much leisure time like the rich and the poor that it can conspire against the public weal, but it's also, not so dispossessed that it's starving and can't engage in civic life. Now, again, whether you are Cicero and you think it should be the moneyed interests that are represented in the aristocracy of the Republic, or whether you think it's Aristotle and it should be the middle class, which I think has a more populist democratic element to it, that's the classic definition of what a republic is within the context of the Aristotelian political discourse. Now, if we look at, I've said this before in another context, the sort of esoteric principles of monarchy is as above, so below, the occult principles. So the gods like Zeus or Tengri or Yahweh rule one over all the spiritual realms. And so there's an earthly representation of this divine king. Now, in that sense, autocratic regimes sort of participate in that occult principle, and that they all sort of, even if they're explicitly atheist autocratic regimes like Stalinist Russia and Maoist China, they all have this esoteric ideal that there is this one unifying person that rules over everyone, and they just have to fall in line. Now, I would argue that this is where the demotist term comes up, that Hitler, Mao, Stalin, Mussolini, they're actually democratic. Now, Slate Star Codex, in his anti-reactionary discussion, talks about demotism, and he basically just writes it off as a term invented by reactionaries in order to lump the worst elements of modern 20th century governments with democratic forms of government. And I would argue that, yeah, that's pretty much the case. I mean, Mao and Stalin and Hitler ruled like the god kings. In fact, the sociologist left, a Marxist, Wittvodel, pointed out that these are the hydraulic empires. These have nothing to do with modern Enlightenment principles of reason and rationalism. These are just the hydraulic empires of the axial age, resurrected with modern day technology. So they have really nothing in principle, either on superficial observable principle or fundamental esoteric principles. They have nothing in common. It's just it's a throwaway line so they can look good to the East Coast liberals in New York. Stalin needed support from the New York bankers, so he had to say he's a democratic state. The other problem is with the reactionary model of looking at this is the triviality of condensing all democracies into universal franchise democracies. So if you look at the first era of democratic republican systems of government in the West, it was the classical world beginning with Athens. And then it continues throughout the rich history of classical Greece, the Roman Republic. At no point in any of these regimes was universal franchise ever seriously considered, ever. There's nothing inherent in the democratic or republican process that would require universal citizenship. In fact, the closest we came to universal citizenship in the ancient world was Caracalla, who in 212 reformed the Roman army, granting citizenship to every adult male in the Roman Empire. It's the Roman Empire, not the Republic or Democratic Athens, that has a universal franchise, sort of. And then furthermore, while we do see a tendency towards egalitarianism in modern day democratic thinking, that I don't think at all is a necessary component of that kind of political process. As we saw, it didn't happen in Athens, didn't happen in the Roman Republic, didn't happen in the medieval Italian republics of Venice and Genoa. It didn't happen in the Dutch Republic. It was conquered by the French Republic and reconstituted as a monarchy after the war. And so I think you could just say, well, no, it's these Enlightenment principles that can be appropriated by hydraulic empires like the Soviet Union, or can be appropriated by the United States. That is the actual driving impetus behind this. But I think the really key important thing here is whether it's Kunin and Ledeen or Hoppe or reactionaries, there is no fundamental similarity or continuity between the hydraulic empires of the Red Eastern Bloc and Hitler and Western principles of consensual government, voting, and anything like that. Because just like the god kings of old, they have the same esoteric understanding that there's this one guy in charge of everything, and it's his job to make sure that everybody falls in line with that. So that's sort of sketching out my sort of stance on the political divisions and where this particular line of inquiry is short. You can't really collapse all of these into one undifferentiated whole. There's too many disparate groups going on. There was a lecture by not regarding politics by Roderick T. Long, and he was responding to the left-wing critique that capitalists were just like fascists. And he said, well, look, the term fascist that they're using in this context actually covers two mutually contradictory concepts. So if a label covers two mutually contradictory concepts, then they can't be in the same label. The label's a bad one. And by the same reasoning that Long gives, I think that putting Demotist states in with ancient Athens, ancient Rome, the 13 colonies is a category mistake of the same order. So I think we'll throw it back to actually, let's throw it to Keith. What do you think on that, Keith?
Well, I could approach this from any number of angles. The point that you just made about how the modern totalitarian states were simply a resurrection of the God King ideas from the ancient world, I think is absolutely correct. I think figures like Hitler, Mao Zedong, Stalin, the Kims in North Korea today, all of those are basically just the Egyptian pharaohs and all of that under another, I mean, it's a different intellectual system, obviously, but conceptually, in practice, it amounts to the same thing. Now, as far as the idea of monarchies and republics and all of that, the argument that I would make was a number of arguments that I would make, but one important argument I would make is that I don't think political systems can be entirely separated from the kind of economic systems that they are attached to. For instance, I'm going to make an almost Marxist sounding argument here, but if you look at the particular mode of production, the particular way in which the economy is organized, you see that that exercises a significant impact on the structures of whatever kind of state system exists. In ancient Greece, for example, Plato and Aristotle and all of those folks talked about the different political systems. They talked about monarchy and aristocracy and democracy and oligarchy or whatever, but they also were in a certain economic model that was pretty much universal, and that was slavery. This was an ancient slave society. Most people who lived in ancient Greece were servants and slaves, and they didn't think about philosophy. They were building the Parthenon and things like that. And then in the Middle Ages, or in most traditional monarchies, you have either feudalism or something similar to feudalism, where you have an agrarian society based on ascribed status and hereditary social positions and castes and all of that kind of stuff. And then with modern democracy, you have capitalism and the market economy and commercial societies and these kinds of things, as well as the wider Enlightenment idea about equality or egalitarianism or libertarianism or however you want to frame it. So I don't think the economic aspects of a particular system can be divorced from the political aspects. And historically, virtually all monarchical societies have either been slave societies or they have been oligarchical republics. For instance, you mentioned you mentioned Cicero said that, well, the moneyed interest should rule. Well, that's a plutocracy. That's the term for that is plutocracy. And there were certainly people among the American founding fathers who wanted to have a plutocracy, and that's partially at least what they created. And historically, most republics have been plutocracies, and today most republics or theoretical republics are either plutocracies or semi-democratic plutocracies. If we want to look at what an absolute monarchy would look like in today's world, well, we can look to several places. We can look to Saudi Arabia, which is probably the closest thing there is to an actual historically modeled absolute monarchy in the world. Maybe the UAE to some degree, and also North Korea. Now they don't consider their system to be a traditional system, but it functions the same way as the kind of ideal monarchical system that Hoppe describes. If Hoppe's basic argument is that, well, an absolute monarch is ideal because the state's assets are his assets. So he's going to manage them like a good corporate manager or something. Well, that's how North Korea works. The state's assets are the royal families. The Kim family is essentially the royal family, and they manage their assets and their interests. Now, whether that's in the interest of the other 25 million people there or not is a separate question, or the surrounding countries. But it seems to me that if you really take that kind of argument to its logical conclusion, there's no real objection to something like North Korea or Saudi Arabia, that kind of system. And yet almost no Western people today would choose that kind of system, given the opportunity. Maybe a handful would, but I think they'd be a small minority. Now, when it comes to democracies, that's an even more complicated idea, because first of all, there's the question of what democracy even is. Robert Dahl, who's a modern political scientist, I guess he's deceased now, but for a long time he was considered one of America's leading academic political scientists. He argued that in the literature there were something like several dozen different definitions of what democracy even is. So it's not even something that political theorists agree on. Carl Schmitt had an interesting view of what democracy is. He argued that virtually anything that has popular approval, or what he called acclamation, could be considered democracy. So, for example, you could have a fascist dictatorship, but as long as most people approve of it or agree with it or like it, what's wrong with that? Why isn't that democratic or communism or theocracy or something like that? So according to Schmitt's theory, as long as the state is acclaimed by its population, it's democratic because it reflects the will of the people. And I think if you take the writings of some of the classic Enlightenment era theorists of democracy, like Rousseau, if you take their arguments seriously, I think you'd have to agree with Schmitt up to a point, because Rousseau had very similar ideas. But I tend to dissent from all of these different paradigms. I tend to have a very negative view of the state generally, and I think that the real issue is the question of power in terms of who holds it and what they do with it. Now, you can have a democratic state or a republican state or a monarchical state or a modern totalitarian state, but all of these kinds of systems hold power, and they have powers, some perhaps more than others. And the question is, how do you keep the system of power that exists, whatever it is, from being abused? Now, with one person rule, like an absolute monarchy or a modern dictatorship, it's virtually impossible to keep that individual from abusing their position. I mean, unless you assassinate them or something like that. With a republic or democracy, you can vote people out, although they have a way of bribing. The elites have in systems like that have a way of, I guess you could say, bribing the people to let them remain in power. Also, there's the question of mob rule, and I think this is one of the main weaknesses in modern democratic theory. In fact, I remember when Hoppe's book came out, Democracy, the God That Failed, I instantly took to that book. I'd probably had a higher opinion of it back then than I would now. But I instantly took to that book because I was like, at last, here's somebody that's willing to criticize modern democracy. Because I had always been interested in thinkers that would criticize modern because the received political mythology we have is, well, now we live in the best of all possible worlds. Modern democracy is it. That's like Francis Fukuyama thought it was the last stage in human social evolution. So I was always interested in points of view that criticized that perspective. And when I discovered Hoppe, I was like, wow, this is great. Now I would say Hoppe is largely derivative of older thinkers like Cunhat Badin and Eric Voegelin and thinkers like that. But I think the real question, though, with all of these ideas is, how do you go about controlling power? Now, from my political perspective, what I'm about is trying to avoid concentrated power to the greatest degree possible and have a society that is organized on voluntarist principles to the greatest degree possible. Now, maybe that's not perfectly workable, but that's the ideal. So as to what kind of institutional arrangements you would have in a system like that, I think there's room for a debate on that. But I think that all of these different systems, democracy, traditional republics, traditional monarchies, have inherent flaws that make the control of power very difficult. Even the most perfect democracy can be a system of mob rule, which I think is just as problematic as a system of elite rule. And I've already described what the other problems are with monarchy and with republic. So it seems to me that all of these systems, whichever one you prefer, you come to the same place in terms of how do you control power.
Okay. Right Ruminations. Why don't we throw the ball to you?
Well, I think that in terms of how you define republicanism, I think that the definition that you refer to that Cicero held is one of probably two that might be workable. The second one is simply the question or the definition of representative government more generally. In which case democracy would be a subset of republicanism. I think that a lot of people maybe have that definition in their heads when they talk about republicanism. Now, in this sense, you might say that that republics are distinguishable from democracies insofar as you're talking about republics that happen to not be democracies. In that sense, I think that a republic would be either, as Cicero and Aristotle identified, a system that combines elements of the one, the few, and the many, so as to make way for some element of representation while still keeping a balance between that and mob rule. But I also think that that with the case of Hoppe, complaining about or lumping all of these divergent expressions of what he sees as democracy. The problem is that in a technical sense, he might be correct that, for example, the British government after the Glorious Revolution in England did contain many representative, you might say, proto-democratic elements. But at the same time, it fails to account for the nuance of the wide spectrum of ideologies or forms of republicanism that exist between, say, what you have in Great Britain today and, say, the republic in Great Britain under Oliver Cromwell. I suspect that Hoppe is not above a certain degree of definitional trickiness. By that, I mean he might be engaged in something very similar to what the libertarians are engaged with, like Murray Rothbard, when he basically defined, or Mises said he wasn't above defining socialism as basically being that which is not 100% laissez-faire capitalism. Now, in this sense, it might be true. There is an element of socialism in any system of economics that's not 100% capitalism. But of course, you could conversely make the argument that in any system that is not 100% socialism, there are also elements of capitalism. So I think that Hoppe's dismissive attitude of representational expressions of government is probably a kind of semantical trick. Now, there is, however, a grain of truth in it, in that psychologically, there may be some similarities between regimes that claim to be democratic and ones that actually have some implementation of democratic principles. By this, I mean that I think that the reactionaries are probably onto something when they point out the seeming unwillingness of the citizens of Soviet regime or communist regimes to rebel. I think that a large part of the unwillingness of democratic or republican citizenries to rebel against the state because they identify with the state is something that carries in to totalitarian regimes that claim to be democratic, because even in those societies, the rhetoric has the effect of making it so that the people come to identify with the state. And I think this goes a long way in helping to explain why there were not more counter-Soviet or counter-communist revolutions. In this sense, I think that the Hoppian critique has a point that the people become less resistant to the state because they come to identify themselves with the state, even if the form of government is objectively reactionary or of an ancient variety. I think that republicanism is a useful concept in that it does help to introduce the principle of limitations. That is, if you have, say, a projection in favor of democracy or autocracy, that's simply favoring one element or the other in society. By contrast, if you say, well, I favor a monarchy or I favor a democracy or an aristocracy, but I also want to add elements of the other principles, there is something inherently libertarian leaning about that, or liberal leaning, in that it suggests some kind of balance or limitation. So in this sense, I think that the Hoppian critique does an injustice to the conversation because it fails to give due credit to the balancing principle, which in practice has probably been that which has predated or presaged any actual implementation of liberal principles throughout history. I think that with respect to something that we had mentioned earlier, the reason that historically you don't really see non-Republican governments, or you might say democratic governments, non-Republican democratic governments integrating into more limited forms of republicanism is just because I think in general states are resistant to limitation. But I think from a individualist or libertarian leaning standpoint, this should be seen as a net desirable thing. But I'll leave my thoughts on that there.
I just want to add also to what Keith said about the Roman state as it was plutocratic was the late republic, arguably under the earlier republic, especially the republic that waged the wars against Carthage. Given the yeoman farmer citizen basis, it had more in common with the ideal that Thomas Jefferson envisioned of a republic of yeoman farmers. Though, of course, without getting into all the details here, that eventually devolved into a plutocratic state. Swithun, so what are your thoughts on all this?
I think Hoppe's argument is with respect to lumping democracy and republics in as essentially the same form of government, or the same type of government, probably more precise. I still think is correct as far as it goes, but the question is how far does it go? They are certainly in certain respects public governments, in that the ruler, the voted in representative is a caretaker and is not an owner, and so has the same incentive problems as Hoppe points out. The question arises, though, which I think arises: are there other incentives at play under particular forms of each of these public governments take, which makes some more preferable to others, which I think is the case. So, for example, the Roman Republic system is clearly not the same as modern day US or the UK, for example. They are clearly different, and they have different incentive structures, although I still think they still have an element of the same incentive structure, being a public rather than a private government. I would note that Hoppe would, I think, distinguish sort of pure communism from democracy, even though they claim to be democratic, in that it has the entire public ownership of the means of production, and so therefore would go into that sort of a Misesian socialist calculation argument, and as to why that couldn't function, at least not for very long, and so would distinguish it on that basis. On that, as an aside, I think using, say, Kim Jong-un as a sort of prototypical sort of Hoppian monarch, I think is unfair, given the fact effectively Kim Jong-un controls the entirety of the country's assets, as opposed to just controlling, at least directly, the monarch's assets. Obviously, of course, he could tax other people, etc., in sort of traditional feudal monarchy. But he's far from the all-encompassing owner of all the state's assets as a so yes, even though he's a private one in a sense, he's not, because he sort of expropriated everybody and is sort of like this single communist dictator. Although the question whether or not in practice it is communism, which it probably isn't, at least not in certain forms. So that's a bit of a convoluted way of saying I do think Hoppe's view of public governance is correct as far as it goes, but it might not go as far as he thinks it goes into explaining the differences between monarchies, modern day republics, and and sort of sorry, I was going to say traditional republics and modern day republics. I'll just note that under the Hoppe analysis, just to be clear, the constitutional monarchy of sort of like England, Britain from the late 17th century, he was still considered proto-democratic in its system. So I think we're broadly agreed that there is differences in practice between a republic and a sort of wide universal franchise democracy. The question is, if the republic is better at, in Keith's words, putting limits on power or at least distributing it, how is it possible to move towards a more traditional republican form of government from the almost sort of mass universal franchise democracies that we've pretty much had since post First World War, etc.? Todd, what do you think?
Yeah, well, the thing that I think needs to be looked at is the ancient classical representative forms of government, whether, you know, again, Athens and Rome being the key examples, but even the medieval examples like the Swiss cantons and Venice. One of the things that modern democratic societies, well, they actually used to do this a little bit, but not anymore. So in the ancient times, to be a citizen, you had to be a member, you had to be serving in the armed forces, either as a hoplite or a legionnaire, or in the case of Athens, as a sailor. And Rome introduced that as well in the wars with Carthage. And so it was sort of the stormtroopers dictum that if you don't have to work for the rights that you get, a citizen is the one who puts his life on the line for the state, and a civilian does not. And then citizens have the franchise, civilians don't. So what ended up happening is even with the idea of a draft, there was this sort of implicit continuation of the notion that, well, look, if you're going to be enfranchised in the political process, you're going to have to at least theoretically be willing to risk your life for the defense of the state. With the abolition of the draft, with obviously feminism, I mean, women aren't going to serve in the Marine Corps, you know, that all broke down. And so now everybody has rights just for breathing, even if you're not local to the United States. That's kind of crazy. I think probably the most direct way to get back to something like a republic would be to have a push for, if you don't serve in the armed forces, you don't vote. That would be at least attempting to reconstitute the classical model in a more concrete way than was maybe mentioned in the Constitution of the United States or other modern attempts at this. Or if not the armed forces, at least some tangible form of public service, that if you're not doing this, then you just don't have a say in the political process at all. And then this becomes, you know, the Senate, if you will, the body of the assembled that then votes on issues. And a whole host of people that even Hoppe would consider parasites and moochers would just go away because they wouldn't serve in the armed forces. I mean, we see this with welfare reform. You know, a lot of people scam welfare. And one of the most effective ways of preventing welfare scam is requiring every couple of years for someone to reapply. And I think it was done in England, and at one point, like 2/3 of the people just didn't reapply because they were scamming it. They didn't want to do it again. And so, you know, you give people these free rides, that doesn't happen. Now, but on a more fundamental level, what constitutes a robust middle class? Let's go back to Aristotle, who defined a mixed government for us. Well, it's the middle class. And what defines the middle class? Well, in Aristotle's mind, widespread property ownership. Now, we're living in a post-industrial age, so widespread property ownership may not be as important as it was in Aristotle's day. But the basic underlying principle that Aristotle's getting at is that we need to have a middle class that is self-sustaining. And so creating political and economic reforms that would create a self-sustaining non-proletarian, non-deracinated working class would be another prerequisite. So that's more of the meta. I mean, to actually make these things happen would be really hard. But these are some of the things that I've thought about how one would transition if one could marshal the political capital to do so. Keith, what are some of your thoughts on that as a strategy for transition?
Well, I think that the idea of limiting the franchise is an interesting one, but I don't see it happening. I think that you're right in the sense that, let's say in the United States, we made it the law, well, to have voting rights, you have to serve in the military. Well, probably most people would just say, forget about voting rights then, because half of the U.S. population that's legally eligible to vote doesn't. In fact, the presidential elections are the only elections where about 50% actually turn out to vote. Most elections, it's only a minority that votes. And if you had to serve in the military to vote, most people, except for people who want a military life, would just say, okay, well, just forget about voting then. Now, I think there would be a problem with that, and not just from a libertarian or whatever perspective. I think a problem with requiring military service for the franchise would basically mean you would have government by a military caste. I see that as problematic. I see government by a military caste as problematic. That's kind of what they had in traditional Hindu societies. That and government by the caste and the priesthood. And I guess in our culture, the universities and the media would be the priesthood, so we don't want that.
Just real quick to interject here, what would you say to Switzerland?
Switzerland? Well, Switzerland, I don't think you have to serve in the military to vote there, do you? They do have.
I'm pretty sure you do, but
well,
if I'm right, what would you say about Switzerland?
Well, I don't think you can compare Switzerland with the United States. It's a much different kind of society. It's something that's geographically very small, very contained. It's to a large degree a rural society. It's something that just has much different traditions. That their system has its roots in the Middle Ages, and ours is something that came out of the Enlightenment, and so it's just in terms of scale and cultural background and all, it's sort of an apples and oranges comparison. Although from what I know about military service in their system, though, military service is more like the National Guard or something than what we think of as military service in the United States. They don't really have a mass army the way that we do, or the way it would be, say, when the United States had full-blown conscription. But you can limit the franchise in other ways, but I don't think that will happen. If anything, I think the franchise will be continued to expand. Nowadays, there's talk about giving criminals, prison inmates, the right to vote. There's talk about lowering the voting age to, say, 16 from 18. Of course, I think I'm pretty sure that it'll be only a matter of time before people that are not formalized, naturalized citizens of the United States are given voting rights, at least on some level. In some places now, they even have illegal immigrants voting, I think in some parts of the United States. I think that the only way to have something resembling a traditional republic would be a move away from concentrated power. Once again, I keep coming back to that same point, but I think that's the main issue. If in the United States we were to devolve power from the federal government to the states and municipalities and things like that, I think the dispersal of power creates the kind of conditions you need for a kind of Republican or quasi-Republican form of government. Now, a problem with that is that, again, there's also the economic issues. This corporatist, plutocratic financial system that we have would still be in place potentially if we dissolved a lot of the federal government. I mean, like a lot of people on the political right in the United States, they say, well, we want to abolish the Department of Education, or we want to abolish the Department of Health and Human Services, basically welfare and public schools and stuff that the right tends to be critical of. But none of that has anything to do with the plutocratic system. What about the Federal Trade Commission? What about the Commerce Department? What about the Federal Reserve? What about the Treasury Department? What about all these other interests that create this kind of centralization of wealth and control over resources in a way that fuels the growth of a Leviathan state. So political decentralization, I think, would have to be accompanied by economic decentralization. And within the framework of political and economic decentralization, it's possible to have something resembling, the kind of classical Republican institutions that a lot of people think are ideal. One system from history that I actually admire is the Holy Roman Empire. I think that was a very interesting system where you had a system of, I guess it was sort of a matrix of institutions where you had all these different institutions that were interlocking with each other in a way that was polycentric, when no one really had a monopoly on power. You had the monarchs, you had the localized principalities, you had the church, you had the guilds, the free cities, and all these different kinds of things. So it was a sort of a polycentric type of order, a matrical type of order, rather than a really concentrated absolutist type of system. And I think that devolution of political economic power could create something on that level. And that, well, technically the Holy Roman Empire was technically a monarchy, but it functioned more like a republic. So I think dispersal of power, once again, is the key, but economic as well as political power.
Okay, Right Ruminations.
Well, I don't agree with the idea of reintroducing the draft in the United States as being a feasible transition into republicanizing the United States. And one of the reasons for this is that I'm not entirely certain that the United States has necessarily been suffering due to democratization. So in Great Britain, for example, same things going on with the rise of political correctness and censorship and kind of increased mob mentality. But I'm not entirely persuaded that the reason for the rise of these things in the United States has been due to any additional democratization, because I think that the various branches of in a Republican system that are ostensibly meant to keep one another in balance are perfectly capable of cooperating with one another without the problem necessarily being identified as further democratization. But insofar as the problem is that the United States has devolved from a constitutional republic to some kind of mob democracy, to introduce the draft, or to reintroduce the national draft, would be at odds with the United States Constitution. Originally, as the Union was configured, there were drafts, there was public military service, but it was at the urging or in the legal context of each of the individual states. I think it was actually the Confederate States of America that was the first American national body to introduce forced military service, and then the Union followed not long after that. But in other words, it's rather ironic to say that you would want to use a strategy that is at odds with the Constitution of the American Republic in order to re-republicanize or reconstitutionalize it, when that act itself would be at odds with the original federal composition of the United States. With respect to what extent you can integrate from a democracy back into a republic, or from a democracy into a republic, while my knowledge of historical republics is not as thorough as it might be, I don't know of many examples of this happening, but I do know of one example of it happening, which is in the American Revolution, which might be a strange way of looking at it, but I will concede that Hoppe is actually correct. That compared to some systems, the parliamentary sovereign system of Great Britain under George III probably was erring on the side of democracy. Whereas, by contrast, the American revolutionaries then, you might say, re-republicanized their circumstances by giving the president some power that the king had lost, like the veto, like reinforcing the power of courts, or resurrecting the power of courts over the legislature and things of that nature. And to sort of scandalize Keith or something, I would say that when Russell Kirk said that the American Revolution was a kind of revolution in the direction of a certain type of conservatism over the liberal British, that he was absolutely correct, in the sense that the British parliamentarian system had probably devolved into something proto-democratic, whereas the American Republic, reverting back to the older Kochian legal principles of divided powers and things of that nature, might be seen as a kind of revolution against the unitary democracy in the British Parliament. But there are few examples of this. The South tried to do it a second time, but they failed because they were then conquered by the North. Now, this is not really an apologetic for Hoppian libertarianism, because these same libertarians who claim to be against democracy are the ones who also condemn the American Revolution as a fight, as a move toward democracy, and therefore bad. I have a very strong feeling that Hoppe would probably have a sort of hostile outlook towards the American Revolution because it's too democratic. But I would argue that kind of to validate his that view, but also to kind of affirm it at the same time, I would say that the American Revolution was probably desirable in that it might have provided one of the few examples of an integration away from a democratic principle back towards a certain degree of republican limitation from the Blackstonian model back to the Kochian legal model of government, which is probably why in the United States there are not hate speech laws as opposed to in the parliamentary sovereign system of Great Britain, where there are, because they have unitary democratic sovereignty. Now, you don't see this very much happening because governments, especially legislative governments, they don't like seeing their power limited. So it should not be surprising that it's very tenuous and very unlikely to revert from a kind of unitary democratic system to something that's more limited. And this is one of the reasons I actually think that the idea of American exceptionalism has gained popularity, or seems to hold some kind of cachet in people's psychologies, is because it's one of the few examples of basically a republic asserting itself over a democracy. I finally think that this is also a piece of evidence against the whitewashing of non-monarchical systems as all being democratic. I would use the British system and the American system as examples of, and the American Revolution as examples of republicanism versus democracy, with the example of the democracy ironically being the British system, with maybe some desirable limitations being enjoyed by the American system. So those are some thoughts on the direction of integration.
Okay, we're going to be opening into closing statements, but before we do that, this might have been due to the shortness of the time available. I was not advocating a return to the draft, but without going into too much detail, the system has been essentially sketched out in Heinlein Starship Troopers. So something more along that line. Switzerland, which he admitted himself was an origin for. So we'll give you the first crack at it, Swithun, your closing statement.
So to reiterate, I do think there is a meaningful difference between forms of public government, which democracy and republicanism would be. I don't see in the near future any move towards republicanism from a democratic system, because the legitimizing ideology is effectively an egalitarianism. And I agree with Keith that you'll probably see more move to enfranchise everybody. So, for example, there's been moves to reduce the voting age to 16 in England and Scotland, and I could see that even in the future going even lower, possibly as a way of undermining what is left of the family as a power base, and just creating everybody almost as individuals under the state with no mediating institutions. The only way that you would probably get away from this sort of universal franchise is to use that ideology against itself by trying to promote secessionist groups in certain areas. Because once you get a small enough group that's vaguely independent, people start getting fed up of people who are loafing on everybody else and causing people actual problems, and you can identify who they are. And then once you know that, you can then limit their influence by effectively restricting the franchise. But until you can get to a critically small mass of people, given the current ideology perpetuated via the media class, etc., I simply don't see that taking place. Although, if you could get smaller secessionist movements going on, you could, but then you have the economic problem that they don't want, the main states won't want them to go. So maybe the way would be a little bit of a New Zion-esque idea of just trying to get special status under an existing government and pay tribute to some extent for them to leave you alone, which I suppose to some extent is what the seasteaders are attempting to do, and various special economic zones. So that might be a more practical way of going than full independence. But that's the only way I see for the foreseeable future to move away from universal democracy.
Okay, Right Ruminations, final statements.
Well, I'd just reiterate my position that there is indeed a spectrum distinction between democracies and republics. They can meld into one another, but it seems to me that distinction of limitation, of pitting the different elements in society against one another, is really the basis and constitutes rather consistently, I think, the only actual prospect for a long-term limitation of state power to one degree or another. I think that insofar as the advocates of libertarianism are indeed in favor of such limitations, then even if they ultimately reject republicanism, they would do well to not overlook it as a kind of corrective principle against state power. And once again, erect the example of the British monarchy as opposed to the American revolutionaries as a rather concrete example of Republican government forming as opposed to a parliamentary system that was already existing. And also as one of the few examples where democratic rule has kind of moved in the direction of republicanism. Final word would be that insofar as we do have examples of attempts of Republican assertion over democratic unitary systems, it tends to be in the spirit of some kind of rebellion or secession or movement away as opposed to a revolution. And in general, systems that try to, or movements that try to place limits on state power tend to be more in the spirit of rebellions as opposed, or secessions as opposed to revolutions. I think that's all for now.
All right, Keith Preston.
A couple of points. First, just as far as something Right Ruminations said earlier about the Hoppe's view of the American Revolution, yes, Hoppe has no use for the American Revolution. That's actually in the Democracy, the God That Failed book. He talks about how colonial America was a more libertarian society than the post-revolutionary society, and how it created a new centralized government. So yeah, that's a correct interpretation of Hoppe. And the Rothbardians generally seem to believe that. I know Gary North has an essay called Why the American Revolution Was a Mistake, or something like that. So that's a fairly common view among the Hoppe Rothbard, Mises circle. But I would basically agree with everything that Swithun just said. I think that as far as trying to limit power, if the idea of converting a mass democracy to a republic is to limit power, that is, having more competing power centers and that kind of thing, as opposed to this kind of unitary mass democratic state. I think that something like secession, or simply working for what the distributist types of the Catholic traditionalist types call subsidiarity, is probably the best way to go. I know that when we look at secession movements, for many years I argued vigorously in favor of secessionism, but in more recent times I've become somewhat more discouraged by that, in the sense that when I look at different secessionist movements around the world, I'm not particularly impressed with some of them. For example, you have the Catalonian secessionists, you have the Scottish secessionists, who basically just want to be another province in the EU. So I don't even see what the point is. I mean, I get what their motivations are, but from the perspective that we're talking about here, I don't even know what the point behind that would be. It seems at bare minimum you would want to leave the EU if you wanted to leave the UK, but apparently not. Also, even with something like Brexit, that's a secession from not just from a state, not from a national state, but simply from a trade zone or a currency union. Look at how resistant the elites have been to that. And I'm sure that if an individual American state try to secede from the United States, Texas or California or something like that, the resistance to that would be even more extreme. So Swithun's idea of these kind of startup society groups, these seasteads, or maybe not something that exotic, but something like special economic zones and all these kinds of things, or something like in the Ottoman Empire, where you had the Malay system, where different ethno-cultural groups and religious communities were able to create their own, what the left anarchists would call an autonomous zone or something like that, where they had some level of sovereignty. That may be the most plausible way to approach that at this point. In the U.S., we have some groups like that, like the Amish, or an example. Although now I've seen, in recent times, I've seen the Amish come under more attacks for things like homeschooling or rejecting vaccinations and stuff like that. But I think that this is a problem that has no easy solution, because the general trend worldwide is towards centralization. It's towards this idea of, if not a global state, a global integrated economic order that functions as a de facto global state. And thinkers on the left and right both have recognized that. And somebody who comes along and says, no, we don't want to be a part of that, is really rejecting the self-legitimating ideology of the global elite. And we see how that typically is responded to. We see what the global elite think of, for example, Islamist groups that have that kind of attitude. And I don't know that they would be any more sympathetic to anyone else, libertarians or traditional conservatives or Christians or left-wing groups, for that matter, or environmentalists, whatever. So it's something of a conundrum.
All right. Again, thanks for Right Ruminations, Keith Preston and Swithun Dobson. This is Todd Lewis of the Praise of Philly podcast, signing off.